Hello now, we got a cold November day here in New England. Got my dog Murdoch back with me. We're going to go ahead and go over Chapter 13, The Rise of a Mass Democracy, 1824 to 1840. Okay, just a couple key points about Jacksonian democracy and Chapter 13 in general. First of all, this is a real shift in the political game, so to say, as aristocratic politics and backroom bargaining fade away. And now there is a belief in a common man. There's a movement towards universal white male suffrage and towards popular campaigning. Now, Andrew Jackson comes to be the face of the common man. Although the book tells us that he did have humble beginnings, he was not necessarily common by the time he was president. And universal male suffrage has been linked to the market revolution. Now, we haven't really talked about that. The American Pageant covers it at a later date. So check the description below for a link to Crash Course number 14, in which they talk about this quite a bit. And so an increased population of American voters now comes to look for a new ideal candidate, and Andrew Jackson represents that. And he represents toughness and bravery, and to some extent, I think, expansion. You know, the language you see here reminds me of the language you may have seen on the dawn of the 20th century by expansionists who were justifying the extension of the American sphere of influence, and using words like bravery and honor and duty there. But here, I think it's the same fundamental traits to that. John Quincy Adams and those like him came to be seen as out of touch with the common man. They're labeled aristocratic, and there were attacks made on his royal extravagances, which I think in this case the Pageant tells us was he bought a pool table for the White House. Here, Andrew Jackson is sort of using that concept of the common man to propel himself into the presidency. And this, from our book, you may have seen it there, is an attack on Jackson's more militant side. And in fact, we know that he was involved in 13 duels and that he was wounded a couple of times. The book says his body rattled like a bag of marbles, but he also had other military exploits as well. And so this phrase Jacksonian democracy really refers to a mass democracy in which there are popular candidates who actively sought office. And so this is very different from the world of the framers. They kind of felt that politicians should be almost forced into the job by their peers. And in fact, that demonstrated their disinterestedness, that they weren't seeking financial gain or glory or anything like that. And so the best way for that to happen in the framers' mind was to have this republic of subsistence farmers, people who were financially independent and didn't have any kind of party allegiance and could therefore rise above their own personal interests and act in the well-being of the country. So if this political shift is finalized by 1828, obviously it begins before that. And we're going to look at the corrupt bargain of 1824 as an example of a major turning point in American politics. And so I do want to say that there's no actual evidence that this deal was ever a formal deal, but it certainly would fit with the type of old-style backroom politics that the Jacksonians will eventually come to criticize quite effectively. So in the election, there are 4 candidates who run. None of them win a majority of electoral votes, although Jackson's in the lead. And so because of that, the decision goes on to the House of Representatives. And in the House, Henry Clay just happens to be the Speaker of the House. And so if the deal was in fact made, Clay agreed to throw the support that he got from the 3 states of Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio behind John Quincy Adams. And in return, Adams would name him Secretary of State. Now, if you want to see more information about sort of the Secretary of State being the pathway to the presidency, and this idea of a bargain, you should see Tom Ritchie's video on Jacksonian American. I did put a link below in the description to that video, so go ahead and check that out. Our textbook takes a bit more of a passive approach and says that, it's a logical decision for Clay to support John Quincy Adams over Jackson, that the two are more closely aligned. So, they're both nationalists, they both favor the American system, and therefore, like I said, it's a logical decision. So you can go ahead and make your own judgment on that particular issue. Henry Clay's honor came under attack after the so-called corrupt bargain of 1824. In fact, this led to a duel between him and John Randolph, during which Clay requested a second shot. Fortunately, I suppose for him, Randolph intentionally fired his second shot over Clay's head, and the two decided this was enough to end the duel, and that honor was restored. John Quincy, much like the first Adams, was not overly popular. In fact, he had more luck as Secretary of State than he did as president. He's actually not in favor of the spoils system, so folks kind of feel let down, I think, at that. He's also nationalistic, and he supported the development of the infrastructure. He dealt fairly with the natives, as you can see, which actually kind of slowed the westward expansion, or at least land speculation in the West. And so, his sort of national vision may have worked in the post-1812 era, but by this time we could say that sectionalism is driving political ideology. And so he sort of alienates himself from the South and the West, and you can see that his support in 1824 was in fact very regional in New England and Northeast. And here he is. He looks happy. This is by far my favorite subject heading thus far in the American pageant. Going whole hog for Jackson. It seems as though America was ready for a change, and certainly Jackson embraced that. He sells himself as a self-made man, and he shows his opponents as dishonest and aristocratic. And given the attitudes about the corrupt bargain of 1824, I think he had a relatively easy time doing that. He does defeat John Quincy in 1828, 178 to 83. The mudslinging was bad, as I showed some of the campaigns before earlier in this presentation. But the victory that Jackson has shows national support, and shows that that national support is for a new Democratic Party. And so the new Jacksonians, they tend to be poorer, they tend to be agrarian, they tend to be distrustful of the widening gap between the rich and the poor, and to some extent they are fearful of, I guess you could say, swindling, dishonest financial gain, whether that is through land speculation or through sort of banking and exploits related to the merchant class and so forth. A new political party emerges to oppose the Jacksonian Democrats, and they, of course, are the Whigs. And so their name is a reference to the English Whigs. They do favor a stronger central government, we'll talk about in a second here. They're led by Henry Clay. Some of the dividing issues, and you can probably guess where these two parties stand on those, would be the Second Bank of the U.S., the tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. Basically, Henry Clay's American system. Don't forget BITS, right? The memory aid, banking, internal improvements, tariffs. Let's talk about Jackson, the person, and the president. We know he's a rugged individual. We know that he was orphaned at a young age and had a knack for brawling. The book tells us that he used his native intelligence, his force of personality, and his powers of leadership to earn a position as judge and a member of Congress. We know he had temper. He was involved with duels as an adult. We also know that he's the first president out of the West, and so maybe Westerners could really identify with him in a sincere way. However, Jackson does not necessarily promote the ideas of his Western predecessors. In fact, rather than advocate for small government and local autonomy, he actually strengthens the role of the president largely through the veto power. Jackson used the spoils system quite a bit, and so this is the rewarding of political supporters of public office, which, I guess it was a good time to bring in some younger officials. A lot of folks are described by the book as being in their 80s and so forth. But, what it does also is it encourages party loyalty, and so this helps to solidify the two-party system. Let's talk now about the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations, as it was referred to. As you can see, it originated in Congress while Adams was still president, and Jacksonians wanted to get it passed while Adams was still in office in order to harm him, politically speaking. And so, unfortunately for them, it's not passed until 1828, but aside from just exposing sectionalism in the United States, it really is a great example of how politics have changed. The Jacksonians were trying to inflict political damage on their opponent. They weren't necessarily fighting for a principle. And so while that's not really similar, or not the same at least, as negative ad campaigns of the modern day, in my opinion, it's dirty pool. You could also say, though, that the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed by the Federalist administration earlier on had a similar approach, in that they were trying to inflict damage on the Democratic Republican Party. The response to that, don't forget, was the suggestion of nullification in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. We will see a similar approach with the Nullies in South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun. Now, John C. Calhoun is vice president at the time, so he has to, argue this anonymously. However, it does raise this old concern or position that a state or a collection of states can declare that a law is of no effect within their state if they feel that it's unconstitutional. And so this crisis is significant, and fortunately Henry Clay is able to smooth out a lot of this conflict. Now, I should mention that South Carolina also said that if the president were to try to enforce a tariff with force, that they would in fact consider secession from the Union. And And so Henry Clay's compromise, which said that it would reduce the tariff by 10% over a period of 8 years, helps to smooth this out. However, Congress in the same breath passes the force bill, or the bloody bill as it was referred to, which says that the president can in fact use the Army and Navy if necessary to collect tariff duties. It reminds me of a response to this. So let's change gears and talk about Andrew Jackson and the treatment of Native Americans. It's estimated that 125,000 natives lived east of the Mississippi by the 1820s. And in 1828, the state of Georgia declared the Cherokee Tribal Council to be illegal and asserted its own jurisdiction over Indian affairs and lands. So the Cherokees will appeal to the Supreme Court, and after some issues in that regard, John Marshall will in fact uphold the rights of Native Americans. Andrew Jackson opposes this, though, and says, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So what follows is the Indian Removal Act, and the enactment of which is often referred to as the Trail of Tears, right? Now this happens under the Van Buren administration, but it's always associated with Jackson. And it was supposed to create a permanent frontier for natives west of the Mississippi, many of which were going to end up in Oklahoma. Shout out time to my Tulsa friends. My sister-in-law, Mrs. Lindstrom, she teaches over at Booker T. Washington High School in the city of Tulsa, a very proud city. Tulsa versus the world, as they say. With the bank war, we see the collision of three pretty significant forces. So let's remind ourselves first, the Bank of the U.S. was a source of credit and stability for the country, but it's also a private institution, and so it's responsible to its investors, and therefore it represents sort of an elite moneyed interest. It's also the principal depository for the funds of the Washington government, though, and as such controlled much of the nation's gold and silver. Now, in 1832, 4 years before the charter of the Bank of the United States expires, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster present Congress with a bill to renew the charter of the Bank of the U.S. And so Jackson's going to be in a tough spot. You know, if he signs this into law, then he's alienating his followers in the West. If he vetoed it, you would see him lose the upcoming election in 1836. This cartoon, you can see Jackson, though, going to war with Biddle over the bank, and we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. And so the charter gets through Congress, and then Jackson declares the bank unconstitutional, and obviously he is directly challenging and opposing the decision that John Marshall penned in 1819 from McCulloch v. Maryland, that the bank in fact was constitutional. So in a sense he's saying that the executive branch is superior to the judicial branch, And now this is actually appealing to the common people that truly didn't identify with the moneyed interest in the East. It wouldn't be till the latter part of the 19th century that we see a shift in that regard. Marshall was not happy then, though. The issue of the Bank of the United States and Jackson's response to it is debated in the election of 1832, and Henry Clay certainly tries to use this to his advantage. Unfortunately, it seems that the common people were more likely to side with Jackson on the issue regarding monopolistic banks, if you want to look at it that way. And you can see that he has quite a decisive victory in the electoral vote. Also in this election, though, is a new third party, the anti-Masonic Party. There's general fear of secret societies, and Jackson was a member of the Freemasons, and so you kind of can see why this party may have existed at the time. But don't forget that other prominent American politicians were also members of this particular society. Following his re-election, Jackson goes about attacking the Bank of the U.S., and so what he does is he starts to remove federal funds from the bank, and he starts to deposit them into the so-called pet banks, which were pro-Jackson to some extent. They also began to flood the country with paper money, and the issue of inflation was so bad that a specie circular was issued stating that public lands had to be purchased with hard currency, with gold and silver. And so this sort of slows the brakes on a speculative boom that was happening with Western lands, and does lead to the financial panic and crash of 1837. Let's talk about the Whigs in 1836 and remind ourselves that their single common ground really was their dislike of Jackson. They had absorbed the anti-Masons and came to criticize Jackson and later Van Buren as being aristocratic, and so to some extent they're blurring party lines and labeling themselves as defenders of the common man, and begin to declare that Democrats are the party of cronyism and corruption. So in 1836, Jackson does not run again. He's old and ailing, and instead he handpicks his replacement, Martin Van Buren. The people were disappointed with him. They called him several things, including a bastard politician and a first-class, second-rate man. But he's able to defeat the leading favorite son of the Whig Party, and that is William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. Here's a picture of Van Buren. Unfortunately for him, Van Buren actually inherited this financial disaster and panic in 1837. And so banks were failing by the hundreds, including many of those pet banks that Jackson had put federal funding in. And Van Buren's proposal is what is called a divorce bill, saying that we should separate the Treasury and the State Department altogether. In its own day, this is not a very popular idea. Let's change gears and look at Texas now. In 1823, there's a new Mexican regime. They actually granted Stephen Austin a large tract of land to settle. He was to bring newcomers to the region, and they were to be Mexicanized, as in they were to adopt Mexican culture and Catholicism. Now, this doesn't really happen, and there's several issues that occur, or differences between the people of Texas and the people of Mexico. And one of those, a very significant issue, is the question of slavery. In 1830, Mexico had emancipated its slaves, and so tensions between Mexico and Americans who had lived in Texas, who did not want to emancipate slavery, are quite clear. So in 1836, Texas declares its independence. It names Sam Houston as its commander-in-chief, and obviously Santa Anna, the Mexican leader, can't allow this to happen, so he sends 6,000 troops into Texas to put down this rebellion. Probably the best-known battle of this would be at the Alamo, right, a 13-day siege in which all Americans are killed. Later at San Jacinto, Sam Houston and his men are able to capture Santa Anna, and they force him to sign 2 treaties which remove Mexican troops from Texas and recognize the boundary of Texas, I believe at the Rio Grande. Now at this point, Texas wants to join the Union, but there's an issue that would complicate this. What's that issue again? The issue of slavery. What do we do with the extension of slavery into Texas? Now, on his last day in office, Andrew Jackson does recognize the Republic of Texas. So in the election of 1840, William Henry Harrison of the Whigs is able to defeat Martin Van Buren, and his slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too does live on. John Tyler will be his vice president, and it's a fairly close vote in the popular vote, but a pretty significant victory in the Electoral College. And now voters really have 2 different economic approaches to support. Do you favor the expanded and stimulated economy, or do you favor sort of an end to the high-flying banks and aggressive corporations? Clearly, folks sided with the Whigs. I wanted to show this cartoon as well and talk about the Cider reference, and sort of how the Whigs are presenting Harrison as a man of the people, as a Westerner, as a frontiersman, and again showing Van Buren as an aristocrat. Again, so talking about sort of the modern political system, by 1840, you can see this solidified shift to popular politics. You also can see a concept of democracy as being respectable. Don't forget that the framers kind of feared popular democracy in general. And as the Pageant says, the common man was at last moving to the center of the national political state. Another significant shift, of course, is the acceptance of political parties in general. Don't forget Washington warned against these, but now by 1840 they're fully entrenched in the American political system. The 2 parties of the day, again, are the Jacksonians and the Whigs. And so that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and check the description for links to the videos I referenced earlier.